Brown, makes millions of dollars, pretending to have recognized a problem she didn't recognize, pretending to solve a problem she hasn't solved, claiming that we could just introduce the interest with the principal, and rather than calling it taxation, we'll still call it interest, even though it's denied to the banks and it's applied to taxation as a property tax, and so on and so forth. And so, what we have to do is to realize where, we can go, because plagiarists are not going to save you. You're believing that you understand this if you think it's as she's called it, a Ponzi scheme, which doesn't even equate to the problem. By definition, a Ponzi scheme is something that more and more people have to buy into, and the people at the top profit and the people at the bottom can't. Well, that's not what's happening here. This obfuscation of the currency obligates us to pay an artificial debt to bankers, which merely publish evidence of our promissory obligations to each other. That's the first problem. And these people didn't start there. They start at the end because they crossed my work, each and every one of them. Bill Steele says in his first video, I couldn't stand to watch it past this, and it's like 5 minutes into it. I have never watched The Money Masters, but there's so much plagiarism in the first 5 minutes, it's pathetic. And this is all by these guys who are advocating interest. They can't even identify the problem. They're actually advocating, And so Bill Steele says in this, he says, I always say, follow the money. Well, when this plagiarism just erupted from my work. In the beginning, there was a fellow named Chris Athanas who had a radio station, and I got an email one day in the earliest days of the internet, and somebody I didn't even know wrote me, and they said, I think you ought to have a look at this. And I went to this guy's pages, and he had my articles published 18,000 times in his web domain, complete, even with my copyright notices. They were in white print on a white background, so you didn't know that they were there unless you selected the text. But why did he do this? Well, one reason that he did this, in the early days of search engines, you could spam a search engine. Well, if you visited my pages, which were acquiring, 100,000 page visits a month in the mid-1990s, if you visited my pages, you might have done so by way of a search for monetary reform or Federal Reserve or whatever. And the articles that I had were very important articles which had been blatantly plagiarized by Ron Paul advocates such as Edwin Vieira, this guy Chris Athanas, Stephen Zarlinga, Jacques Shakerin, Ellen Hodgson Brown. So they've been plagiarized ever since. But why did this guy Athanas do this? Well, the main reason was if you searched for Federal Reserve on any search engine at the time, there were many of them, my pages would appear number one, even above the Federal Reserve. Practically any search you could do on monetary reform, cause of the First Great Depression. One of the articles was mathematic proof the Federal Reserve caused the First Great Depression. Since then, people have been talking about a Second Great Depression. Why? That idea was planted in their heads by this article, whether it was from a plagiarist later or originally from my work, which was so visited. But Chris Athanas borrowed one of a caption which appears under the quote under my signature on my present web pages, which wasn't this follow the money, a well-known saying that we all have. And Bill Steele's, many years after this has existed on all of my work, he avoids plagiarism because he's aware of my work, okay? Doesn't give the whole saying, which has much further meaning. The quote that appears under my signature of my pages, and I'm not doing this to talk about myself. I'm doing this to expose the phonies before us who are deviating your attention from a fact, a plain and simple fact of singular solution, which I'm not charging anybody any money to learn. I presented this from day one, 40 years ago at my cost. But anyway, the quote that's appeared, in which Chris Athanas was actually promoting on his radio, and actually he came clean, he took these pages down, he attributed this work to me, but then a year or so later, all these other articles started appearing one by one, very slowly, where he'd take even this practically exact same title of an article of mine, Interest is Usury, and then obfuscate it into their own article, pretending to author it. So he took all of my work and replicated it on his site. And other people, many other people, have done this ever since. So, in fact, if you see a quote on the internet, which basically equates to this purported quote of Thomas Jefferson, if the American people ever allow the banks to issue their currency, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and corporations which will grow up around them until their children wake homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. That quote comes from my web pages. How do I know that? Well, I was informed in the mid-1970s that by academia, many college professors, notified me that Thomas Jefferson never said that. Well, of course, it's close enough akin to other things that he's said that you wouldn't really doubt this from a verbal account of it. But nevertheless, why have I maintained it for all this time? It was part of my original Parable of Perfect Economy, which I explained, came from an original story that was told to me in 1975 by a fellow Jacques Walker in Valdez, Alaska, in a presentation on colonial economy. Well, this never existed, actually, and I eventually, in order to continue to tell a story that was even more evocative in thinking, I turned it into a parable, where the actual words of Benjamin Franklin are actually the words of Mike Montagne issued through Benjamin Franklin's mouth. And so this is how we get to this focus here in the terminal stages of this economy. We get to this focus on Ellen Hodgson Brown's Pennsylvania currency. How did a lawyer ever get interested in a colonial currency? Okay. Well, I asked her, in the op-ed news forums, how she claimed it was that this banking system of Pennsylvania was non-inflationary, and I asked her to explain how that is. In other words, I was baiting her. I wanted to know why anyone who had formulated solution wasn't likewise claiming that it solved deflation. And in fact, the problem that I saw, which jumped out at me, is because, as I said earlier, the one defect that I left in this story was that it was actually inflationary. Okay? So I was asking her to, in effect, use my words, which she thought were from Benjamin Franklin's, to explain something which wasn't even true, so I could invalidate it. And she realized she was in a corner, and she exited the debate. Okay, excusing herself that she had to rush off to Europe to visit like 3 or 4 different countries and had exhaustive, speaking engagements, and she would have to resume this later, which of course she never did. Okay, but that's Ellen Hodgson Brown, and so what we have before us is a situation where this economy basically it's a process of deflation from a circulation, which is only some of the principal that exists, to pay not only all of the principal that's owed, but the interest on it while accumulating an ever greater debt. So from this alone, we can understand that you can't fix this thing. It can only crash. And it crashes as a result not of what Ron Paul is claiming is inflation, but it crashes as a result of this overpowering deflationary aspect or obligation of this obfuscation of the currency. Now, how do we fix this thing? I'm going to go through this kind of quickly because we're getting pretty close to the 3 hours I was intending to speak on this. How do we solve this thing? Well, I have a paper that I've it's existed in various forms for many years, and it's a little bit technical for people to want to read it because it's a little bit dry, but it basically explains this. Its title is If I Were President. And it explains how to arrest this failure in a single day. Well, that sounds audacious to us. I mean, I understand how that would sound audacious. I mean, even if you have some confidence in the facts that I've identified the fundamental cause and proven to your satisfaction a fact of singular solution. If I tell you now that the title of this article is If I Were President. And it details how and why you would solve the present failure in a single day. That is actually a conservative statement because we could solve it in a matter of under a minute. How? By simply ordering everyone to cease payments against these artificial debts to the banking system until we refinance them under mathematically perfected economy. Now, if this isn't what you want to do as a subject of this failure, turn off your computer right now. You don't need to hear any of this. You're part of the problem, and if it isn't worth waiting through this to you, I mean, you can be drinking a beer right now and relaxing, and all you have to do is take this in. Okay? We have, as I've explained, we have an artificial debt which isn't even owed to these banking systems. How can you possibly injure them by not paying the debt? Well, you say, oh, but all the banks are going to fail. No. You're using one term for two different things. There's the central banks, which is one form of bank, and then there is all the peripheral banks. And yes, they will fail. Why will they fail? They will fail anyway. They will fail because when we can't pay our debts, they can't pay the money that they quote-unquote borrowed from the Federal Reserve. They will fail. But why should we save them? All that we're doing is preserving this thing that insulates the central bank, the fact that the central bank is actually just publishing evidence of our promissory obligations to each other. So because these peripheral banks borrow, quote-unquote, borrow the money from the Federal Reserve, we think we have to borrow it from them and that earned wealth is at stake. And all it is an evidence of our own debt to each other, not to the banking system at all. Okay? So we seize payment against all our debts. And immediately, all the money that you're paying to service these debts is available to sustain further commerce. We would be able to afford a far greater amount of our own industry immediately. People would go back to work instantly, and more so over time without any change whatsoever. Just as, in effect, as I discussed it with some other person, and I'm sorry, Anne Minsk or something. Anyway, the word that she used was very appropriate. She says, okay, so this is just a timeout. Yes, I said, it's a timeout. Okay, until we rectify our debts by refinancing them under mathematically perfected economy, counting all prior payments of interest instead toward principal. Well, what is the effect of this? I was listening as we started this. This morning there was a show on TNS Radio here, and the fellow was explaining that he was losing his house. They were foreclosing on him. Well, this process of refinancing your debts under mathematically perfected economy needs to be understood very well. How would this save us from this? This man wouldn't lose his house. he wouldn't lose his house. And why would that be? Well, let's just